350 million years ago, Earth was nothing like today. The air was thicker, the forests were taller, and bugs were the size of birds. It was a world built for giants, before flowers, before dinosaurs, before even grass. But something strange happened during this time that changed our planet forever. What kind of Earth creates coal, giant dragonflies, and the first reptiles, all at once? It was a world so different from today that it could have been another planet. The air felt heavier, full of moisture and warmth, like a thick, wet blanket wrapped around everything. There were no flowers, no grass, no birds, no dinosaurs, nothing you would see outside your window today. But it was full of life, strange life, giant life. Life that crept, buzzed, crawled, and breathed through thick forests where the trees rose like green towers, and the sky looked dim and far away. This was Earth during the Carboniferous period, a time more than 350 million years ago, when the land was wild and untouched, and the rules of life were just beginning to change. Imagine walking into a forest where the ferns are taller than houses, where tree trunks are not like today's bark-covered giants, but soft and spongy, almost like wet rope twisted together and stretching up into the sky. The ground beneath your feet would squish with every step, soaked with dark water and rotting leaves. It would smell rich and sharp, full of mud and something old. There would be fog in the air, curling around thick vines and bending around the legs of huge insects resting on giant fronds. The sound would be strange too. Not quiet, but not like today's woods either. You'd hear the buzzing of insects the size of dinner plates and the slow slosh of water moving through low, swampy pools. You'd hear clicking, croaking, and the gentle hum of something just beneath the surface, something waiting. This was a time when Earth's continents looked nothing like the shapes we know now. Most of the land was part of two giant landmasses. In the north was a continent called Laurussia. In the south, a supercontinent called Gondwana. These landmasses were slowly drifting toward each other, pulled by deep forces under the Earth's crust. The land between them was mostly covered in shallow seas and giant swampy forests. The air had more oxygen than today, about 35%, which is much higher than the 21% we breathe now. That made breathing easier. That also meant creatures could grow bigger, and they did. Dragonflies with wings nearly 2.5 feet wide soared through the heavy air like small birds. Giant millipedes, some as long as a car, crawled across the forest floor, moving slowly through ferns and roots. Everything seemed oversized and otherworldly. It was Earth, yes, but not the Earth we know. The warmth came from the sun, but also from deep inside the planet. Volcanoes sometimes rumbled in the distance, and their ash would float over the forest like a gray snow. Lightning storms flashed often, lighting up the clouds with quick bursts of white and blue. And because of the high oxygen levels, fires could spread fast and burn hot. But even after the fires ended, the plants grew back quickly, rising tall again like green curtains pulled across the land. These forests never stopped growing. When the plants died, they fell into the wet, soggy ground and didn't fully rot. Instead, layers and layers of dead plants built up over time, pressing down on each other. The pressure and heat turned those layers into something new: coal. Thick black seams of energy-rich rock formed slowly under the ground. That's why this time is called the Carboniferous. It means coal-making. The coal we dig up and burn today. Coal that powers cities and warms homes was made from those ancient forests, still holding the sunlight of millions of years ago. Beneath the surface of the swamps, water moved slowly. It carried tiny pieces of broken plants and animals, dropping them into thick muddy layers that would someday become rock. In these muddy places, fossils began to form. Imprints of leaves, the shells of small sea creatures, and even the bones of early animals settled into the mud like whispers, frozen in time. And above that mud, life was changing. Amphibians, which had once only lived in water, began to crawl farther onto land. They were big and strong, with wide, flat heads and thick tails. They could breathe air and walk, though they still needed to return to water to lay their eggs. These were Earth's first real land animals, bold, cautious, and new. But they were just the beginning. Everywhere you looked, life was pushing forward. Trees without leaves, just long fronds like giant feathers, spread out their branches to soak up sunlight. Spores drifted through the air like dust, landing on wet places where new plants would grow. There were no flowers, no fruits, and no bees to carry pollen. Instead, plants depended on water, wind, and luck to keep growing. And they did. The forests spread wider and thicker every year, covering the land in a green maze of trunks, vines, and roots. The swamps stretched for thousands of miles, across what would someday be North America, Europe, and Asia. Far from the swamps, in the open seas, life looked different. The oceans were warm and full of creatures. Sharks with wide, toothy mouths swam through deep channels. Crinoids, which looked like plants but were actually animals, waved in the currents, catching tiny food from the water. Brachiopods, which had hard shells like clams, sat still on the ocean floor, opening and closing with the rhythm of the tides. Trilobites still scurried around, though they were fewer now than before. The oceans were a place of movement, full of glowing fish, soft-bodied creatures, and silent hunters drifting just below the surface. And all across Earth, something was building. It was slow. It was quiet. But it was steady. The land was changing. The creatures were growing. The forests were feeding the ground. And deep beneath the wet soil, time was recording everything. The wind carried spores. The sun fed ferns. The water carved new rivers. The air held secrets. And Earth, in all its wild green power, was preparing for something new. Something that would come after. Something that would change everything again. But for now, it was the time of the swamps. The time of giants. The time when Earth was rich with oxygen, covered in ferns and humming with life from root to sky. The Carboniferous had begun. The air felt alive. It was thicker than what we breathe today, filled with warmth, moisture, and something more, something hard to see, but easy to feel. Oxygen. Lots of it. Today, the air we breathe has about 21% oxygen, but during the Carboniferous, it may have reached as high as 35%. That's more than 1/3 of the air filled with the stuff that keeps animals alive and fires burning. It changed everything. It made the world feel heavy and strange. With every breath, lungs filled faster. Muscles worked longer. And the creatures of this ancient Earth began to grow in ways never seen before. The sky, gray with low clouds, held a strange silence, until it didn't. A sudden blur zipped between tree trunks, slicing through the thick fog. It wasn't a bird. There were no birds. This was a dragonfly, but not like the ones you see today. Its wings stretched almost 30 inches across, wide enough to cover a small child's arms if they held them out. Its name was Meganura, and it ruled the air. The high oxygen made flight easier. The wings didn't have to work as hard to lift its long, stick-like body. It glided through the swampy forests like a silent hunter, its sharp eyes scanning the dark leaves below for prey, maybe a smaller insect, maybe something even bigger. On the ground, thick with moss and rotting leaves, more giants crawled. A black shape slithered over roots, its many legs moving like waves across the forest floor. This was Arthropleura, a millipede longer than a grown man. Some of them reached lengths of 8 feet. That's the size of a sofa, but this creature didn't sit still. It crept and curled, its body armored like a tank. It had no predators, not yet. Nothing was big enough, strong enough, or fast enough to catch it. The forest was its home, the leaves, its food, the air, its shield. And just above it, another monster waited. Pulmonoscorpius, the scorpion with claws as wide as a dinner plate, held still on a branch, its tail curved, its pincers ready. This was the age of the bugs. Not the tiny flies we swat away today, but insects and crawlers that ruled land and sky. They didn't roar or howl. They hissed, clicked, and buzzed, and they were everywhere. The warm, wet swamps made the perfect place for them to thrive, and the oxygen made them giants. The air they breathed didn't need to be pulled deep into lungs. Most of them didn't even have lungs. They pulled air through holes in their bodies called spiracles. With so much oxygen in the air, even the deepest parts of their bodies could get what they needed without much work. It wasn't just the insects that grew. Everything seemed to stretch taller, wider, longer. Even the flames. Fire during this time was different. A single spark, maybe from lightning, maybe from rock hitting rock, could light an entire forest. The high oxygen made fire hungry. It burned fast. It burned hot. It jumped from tree to tree, leapt across dry spots, and turned green jungles into glowing red storms. But the forests always came back. The plants were strong and fast-growing. Just a few months, and the black ash would be covered again in green. Fires weren't the only danger. In a world so wet and thick, floods were common. Rain came often. The rivers ran full. The ground, already soggy, couldn't hold more water. When the skies opened, the forest floor disappeared beneath pools and rivers. Creatures that could swim did fine, but others had to climb, dig, or wait. The waters would rise, then fall. Each time, they left behind layers of dead plants. Leaves, trunks, roots, all packed under water and mud. These layers, year after year, would one day become coal, holding the story of this strange world locked deep in the ground. And through all of this, the storms, the fires, the floods, life kept growing. More creatures crawled from the water. Some had strong legs and wide feet. Some still looked like fish but breathed through lungs. These early land animals, mostly amphibians, moved slowly but surely away from the water's edge. They weren't as big as the insects, but they had something new. Spines that held their bodies up, lungs that pulled in the rich air, and skin that let them feel the world around them. They were testing the land, finding new ways to live. The oxygen helped them too. It made their bodies more powerful. It gave them energy. And as they walked under the shadows of giant ferns, they left behind prints that would one day turn to stone. But not all creatures grew. Some stayed small, hidden under leaves or in the cracks of bark. They had to hide from the giants. They had to move fast, be quiet, and survive. In this world, being small meant danger. A wrong step, a sudden movement, and they could be crushed or eaten. The large insects ruled, and the rest followed. Still, the air had its cost. Too much oxygen could be dangerous too. It made fire easier, yes, but it also made breathing a risk. Tiny changes in heat or gas could cause trouble. The balance was delicate, and something about this time felt like it couldn't last. The insects were too big, the trees too soft, the air too rich. Something was coming. A change, but not yet. For now, the forest was alive with movement. The giant dragonfly flew once more across the treetops, chasing something too small to see. Below, the millipede slipped under a rotting log. The scorpion clicked its pincers in the shadows. The fog thickened. The rain began again, gentle at first, then heavier. Drops landed on wide green leaves and slid into the black soil below. Thunder rolled in the distance. The sky, filled with oxygen, hummed with electricity. The forest waited. Every breath, every flap of a wing, every step through mud told the story of a world unlike ours. It was a time of giants, a time of fire, a time when air itself changed the shape of life. And deep in the heart of this world, something new was getting ready to appear. The forest was unlike anything we know today. It rose up from dark, soggy ground and thick green walls, tight and tangled, like a maze with no paths. The trees stood tall, but looked strange. They didn't have bark like oaks or pines. Instead, their trunks were soft and full of water, covered in patterns like fish scales or rope. Some trees grew over 100 feet high, almost as tall as a 10-story building. And their leaves were long, flat, and thin, stretching out like fingers trying to touch the sun. But the sun was far away, hidden behind low clouds and constant fog. Light didn't pour in. It crept between the leaves, gray and tired, just enough to make shadows dance over the wet ground. This was a forest that never rested. Everything grew, everything reached, and everything was wet. The ground was never dry. It squished under every step and pulled at anything that stood still too long. The roots of the trees, thick and twisted, wrapped around each other like snakes, digging deep into the soft earth. Pools of water formed in every low spot, dark and still, with bubbles rising from the mud. Dead leaves floated on the surface. Some had just fallen. Some had been there for weeks. And below the water, a thick layer of rotting plants was building up, slowly turning into something else. The trees didn't grow from seeds like many do today. Most spread by spores, tiny dust-like bits carried by wind or water. Some, like the giant club mosses, stood as tall as buildings, but they grew fast and died young. They dropped their spores in the air, letting them drift until they found the right damp place to grow. If the ground was too dry, nothing happened. If it was too wet, they drowned. But in this forest, the balance was just right, at least for now. All around, giant horsetails and ferns rose in thick crowds. They didn't have flowers. No colors brightened the forest, no petals opened to the light. Everything was green, brown, or black, coated in dampness, hiding the world in shadow. When a tree died, it didn't fall with a crash. Its trunk softened slowly, bending under its own weight. Mushrooms, moss, and other small plants covered it, breaking it down bit by bit, but not all the way. In this low-oxygen world near the forest floor, rot was slow. The dead wood piled up, and the forest didn't stop to clean. It simply grew over the top. Layer upon layer of plants stacked one on another, pressing the oldest deeper into the ground. Over millions of years, heat and pressure would change this thick, dead forest floor into coal, a deep black rock full of energy from ancient sunlight. Sometimes, the forest floor moved. A river shifted. A flood came. Or rain poured for days and days without stopping. Water rushed over roots and pushed trees sideways. In a single day, a whole part of the forest could disappear under mud. The plants buried there, still whole, would never see sunlight again, but they would still matter. They would become part of the planet's memory, written into stone over millions of years. And above them, life would begin again. Everywhere, the forest was alive with sound. Not loud like today's jungles, but filled with quiet motion. The whisper of leaves rubbing together, the soft drip of water from branch to branch, the flap of insect wings as something large moved overhead, the slow crack of a tree trunk bending too far, and sometimes silence. Deep, wide, endless silence, where even the wind seemed afraid to speak. That silence was part of the forest too, a silence so thick you could feel it pressing against your ears. Not many animals lived up in the trees. There were no monkeys, no birds, no squirrels. The upper branches were mostly empty. Life stayed low, close to the ground, where the air was heavy and the food was thick. Giant insects rested on tree trunks, blending in with the soft brown bark. Some had wings that looked like leaves. Others had armor that shone in the gray light. They moved slowly, unless hunting, then snapped forward in quick bursts. Amphibians with wide mouths and stubby legs crept along roots and slipped into shallow pools. Their skin was smooth, always wet, and their eyes blinked without warning. Under the surface of the mud, things stirred. Worms, bugs, and burrowing creatures dug through the soft ground. They chewed dead plants and mixed the dirt, turning the forest floor into a living, moving skin. Every inch was alive with something. And above it all, the trees reached higher still, trying to catch more of the weak sunlight, trying to outgrow each other in the endless race for light. But deep in the forest, where light barely touched and fog never lifted, strange shapes moved, creatures learning new ways to live. Some had bones strong enough to stand tall. Some had lungs good enough to breathe far from the water. They were still small, still few, but they were trying. They were learning to take over a world built by plants. And the plants, busy growing and dying, didn't even know. The Carboniferous forest was rich, but fragile. It held more life than any land had before, but its world depended on things staying the same. Warm weather, high water, thick air. Any change could undo it all. And somewhere in the distance, a change was coming. Not yet. Not today, but soon. For now, the forest grew, layer after layer, each one pressing the last deeper into time. It held the sunlight, it held the air, and it held the memory of a world where trees had no flowers, animals still feared dry land, and the ground itself was becoming coal. Far below the roots of the forest, something quiet but powerful was happening. It was slow, too slow for any eye to see, but it never stopped. The ground was building a memory. Every dead leaf, every broken trunk, every layer of mud pressed down onto the one beneath it. Day by day, year by year, the forest floor thickened. A tree would fall. Rain would soak its soft trunk. Bugs would crawl across it, and small creatures might dig beneath it. But in time, the weight of the forest above would press it deeper into the ground. The heat from inside the earth would warm it. The pressure from the weight above would squeeze it, and little by little, it would change. It would no longer be a tree. It would no longer be anything soft or green or alive. It would become coal, hard, black, and full of the energy from the sun that once fed the tree. This was the quiet work of the Carboniferous. Not just a time of growing, but a time of saving. The sun gave its light to the trees. The trees gave their bodies to the earth, and the earth held on to them, locking away their energy beneath rock and soil for millions of years. This is why today we find deep seams of coal beneath places that once were swampy forests. Coal is not just rock, it is the remains of forests long gone, a memory of a time when the land breathed with green life. In some places, you could already see the layers forming. If the land shifted or a river cut through a hill, the walls beside the water would show dark stripes, bands of black and brown and gray. Each stripe told a story. This layer was made of ferns that fell after a flood. That one was from a fire that burned for weeks. Another came from the remains of giant trees crushed by a sudden storm. Over time, the colors changed as the dead plants changed. Some bands were soft and crumbly. Others were hard as stone. But they all came from the same thing. A world that had once lived and breathed and stretched toward the sun. The air, still heavy with oxygen, helped this process in strange ways. Fires burned brighter and faster than today. But that fire helped clear old growth and make room for new plants to rise. The ash added minerals to the soil. The burned trunks fell and became part of the forest floor. Fire was not just an end, it was part of the cycle. And deep underground, the ash and heat and pressure turned more of the forest into black stone. This was not a clean or easy process. It was messy. It was wild. It was full of smells and sounds and danger. The forest floor reeked of rot and wet earth. Insects buzzed and clicked. Amphibians splashed through muddy pools. Even small shifts in the ground could send trees tumbling and rivers changing course. One day a place could be dry and filled with moss and sun. The next, it could be underwater, drowned in brown floodwater that brought leaves, branches, and entire trunks down from upriver. The water did not ask. It did not wait. It simply took. And when it left behind more layers, more things for the earth to press down and turn to stone. But sometimes the earth gave a clue. In some places, soft coal had already begun to form. It crumbled like black paper in your hand, light but full of power. In other places, it had hardened into rock so dense it sparked when struck with another stone. These differences showed how long the layers had waited, how much heat and pressure they had felt, how deep they had been buried. The oldest coals were like glass, shining in the sun with a dark fire. The youngest were soft and dusty, still smelling faintly of the forest they had come from. Above all this, life continued. Trees grew, ferns spread, insects crawled, amphibians leapt. The forest didn't stop to notice what was happening below. It didn't know it was building something lasting. It didn't know that its own death would give energy to creatures in the far future, ones who would dig into the ground and find these black stones and wonder where they had come from. The forest just lived, and when it died, it gave itself to the earth, which took it in silence. The process was so slow, so gentle, that no creature alive then could have understood it. But it was steady, and it would not stop. Layer by layer, Earth was writing a history book, not with words, but with leaves and trunks and mud. Not with ink, but with coal. It would hold that book tight, deep in its hands, waiting for someone to come along and learn how to read it. Someone who would know how to split rocks, how to dig tunnels, how to burn stone and turn it back into fire. In that fire, the ancient sunlight would return. The light that had once fed the forests would rise again in smoke and heat, but that would come much later. For now, the forest grew, the trees died, the ground thickened, and the earth kept building its memory, black, quiet, and full of power. Beneath the waves, far from the towering trees and soggy forest floors, a different world was unfolding. The ocean during the Carboniferous period was warm, wide, and alive with motion. It was a place of strange creatures, glowing colors, and deep shadows. The water was not quiet. It swirled and pushed, always moving, always shifting, like a blanket of liquid glass wrapping the planet. Sunlight danced across the surface, then bent and faded as it sank, turning golden streaks into green beams, and finally into deep blue darkness. In these salty waters, life swam, crawled, floated, and clung to every surface. It was not a peaceful world, but it was rich, and it was old. Close to the shore, where rivers met the sea, muddy water poured into wide bays and shallow shelves. Here, the ocean floor was soft, made of sand, clay, and crumbled bits of dead things. This was the home of creatures that moved slowly, or not at all. Crinoids stretched up from the bottom like underwater flowers, though they were not plants. Their arms waved in the current, catching tiny pieces of food that floated by. Each one looked delicate, like lace made of bone. They clung to the floor with long stalks, sometimes growing more than 3 feet tall, waving in the current like a quiet field under the sea. Nearby, strange shelled animals lived in clusters. Brachiopods, with shells that looked like clams, sat still and opened their mouths to the water. They filtered food from the sea, never moving from their spot. Some shells were smooth, others had ridges and bumps like tiny armor. Between the brachiopods, trilobites scurried, their bodies covered in hard plates. They looked like little tanks with legs, their eyes sticking out on short stalks. Though they were slower now, fewer than before, they still held on in the quiet spaces of the sea. They dug into the mud, leaving tracks that looked like tiny roads across the ocean floor. But not all creatures crawled. Many swam, and in the deeper waters, sharks ruled. These were not the sharks of today. Some were long and sleek, moving through the sea like silent knives. Others had odd shapes, flat heads, strange fins, or saw-like teeth. One giant shark, called Tenacanthus, reached over 30 feet long, nearly as long as a school bus. It had spiny fins and a long tail that cut through the water like a whip. It hunted anything smaller than itself, its jaws filled with rows of sharp teeth. But even it had to move carefully. The sea was full of danger. There were fish with armor instead of scales. Their bodies were covered in plates so thick it looked like they wore metal suits. Some had tiny mouths and floated slowly. Others darted like arrows, flashing silver in the dim light. They fed on smaller fish, worms, and whatever floated past. Some could breathe both water and air. rising to the surface to gulp when the water lost its oxygen. These fish were survivors, living in places where others couldn't. Their strength wasn't always speed or size, it was their ability to wait, to hide, and to outlast. Coral reefs grew in some places, though they looked different than the ones we know today. The reef builders back then were not the same as modern corals. These early reefs were built by sponges, bryozoans, and small animals that stuck together to form rocky towers. Fish darted in and out of these spaces. Crabs, though not yet common, had distant relatives that climbed along the coral, using tiny claws to grab at passing food. Everything had a job, everything had a place, and everything lived in balance, for now. The deeper waters were darker, colder, and quieter. Few things lived there, but those that did were strange and strong. Long, soft-bodied creatures drifted with the currents, their tentacles glowing faintly in the dark. They fed on whatever fell from above: dead fish, bits of plants, or drifting pieces of shell. There were no lights, no colors, just motion and patience. Down here, life moved slowly. But even in the deepest dark, the ocean was never still. Sometimes great storms rolled across the sea. The wind screamed. Waves rose high, crashing into each other like angry hills. In these storms, the top of the ocean turned wild, tossing sea creatures in every direction. Reefs broke. Mud churned. Animals were torn from their homes. But when the storm passed, calm returned. The sea remembered. The pieces fell back to the bottom, and life began again. There were no whales, no dolphins, no sea turtles. Those animals would come much later, but the sea didn't miss them. It had its own wonders. Long ago, before bones filled the land, before flowers opened in the sun, the ocean was a kingdom of its own, a place where time moved like a tide, slow, steady, and full of change. Just like on land, the ocean was storing memories. Shells that sank into the sand would one day become fossils. Layers of mud would press together and turn to stone, trapping the shape of a crinoid, the path of a trilobite, or the teeth of a long-dead shark. These stories waited in silence, hidden under the sea, until someone in the far future would find them and wonder what kind of world they came from. For now, the sea kept its secrets. Fish darted, shells clicked, tentacles reached, and far above, the sky shone faintly through the surface, its light touching only the top of this ancient world. The Carboniferous ocean was not quiet, and it was not empty. It was full of life, wild, strange, and ancient. A place where things swam that no longer swim, and where the earth's memory settled softly to the bottom with each falling tide. At the edge of the swamp, where trees thinned and soft mud met still water, something stirred. It wasn't an insect this time, or a giant millipede, or even one of the great dragonflies that buzzed like birds through the hot, foggy air. This was different. A new shape, low to the ground and moving with care. It looked like a fish, but it wasn't swimming. It looked like a lizard, but it wasn't fully on land. Its body was long, its skin wet and smooth, and its wide mouth opened and shut as it breathed thick air. This was an early amphibian, one of the first brave creatures to step out of the water and try something new. It wobbled forward on four short legs, each foot flat and spread wide, its belly brushing the ground with every step. It blinked. It sniffed. And then it crawled a little farther, deeper into the unknown world above the waterline. This small animal was part of a big change. For millions of years, life had lived only in the sea. But now, during the Carboniferous period, some creatures were learning how to leave the water behind. They still needed it to survive, especially for laying their eggs, which would dry out without it. But they were starting to breathe air, walk on land, and explore the shadows of trees and ferns. These amphibians came in many shapes and sizes. Some looked like giant salamanders with round heads and long tails. Others had tiny legs and slithered more than they walked. Most of them stayed close to rivers, lakes, and swamps, never too far from the safety of water. But every step they took was a step forward in the story of life on land. In one quiet part of the forest, a wide pool sat in the middle of thick trees. The water was still, except for small ripples made by insects skating on the surface. A dragonfly zipped by, its wings a blur. Then, with a soft splash, an amphibian rose from beneath the water. It blinked its wide eyes and opened its mouth in a slow yawn, showing rows of small, sharp teeth. Its nostrils flared. It could smell something in the air. Maybe food, maybe danger. Slowly, it pulled itself onto a rock at the edge of the pool, its feet slipping slightly on the wet moss. It stayed there for a while, soaking in the sun that filtered down through the tall trees. This was a risky place to be. Birds didn't exist yet, but giant insects, scorpions, and other predators made the forest floor a dangerous place. The amphibian didn't move much. It listened. It waited. Then, sensing safety, it pushed forward again, disappearing into the ferns. These early amphibians were not fast. They were not strong, but they had something special: lungs. Unlike fish that pulled oxygen from water with gills, amphibians could draw air directly into their bodies. Their skin also helped them breathe, as long as it stayed moist. This is why they lived near swamps and lakes, where the air was wet and the mud was soft. Their lungs were simple, but they worked. And with them, amphibians could rest on land for hours, even days. They could move between water and earth, crossing from one world into another. Some amphibians were only a few inches long, thin as a finger. Others stretched over 3 feet from nose to tail. One kind, called Proterogurinus, had a long, narrow body and powerful legs, perfect for crawling through underbrush and slipping into ponds. It hunted insects, smaller amphibians, and anything it could fit in its mouth. Another, Crassigurinus, had tiny limbs and spent most of its time in the water, using its strong jaws to snap at passing prey. These animals were clumsy on land, but quick in water, swimming with side-to-side flicks of their tails. At night, the forest was a different place. The air grew cooler, but never cold. The fog thickened. The light vanished, and strange sounds filled the dark: clicks, croaks, buzzing, and splashes. In a shallow stream, an amphibian crouched beneath a fern, its eyes wide in the low light. A shape moved past in the water, a long insect larva, soft-bodied and slow. The amphibian lunged, snapping it up in a flash. Then it stayed still again, waiting for the next movement, the next chance. Its body blended with the mud, its breathing slow and even. It had learned to be a hunter. But these animals were also prey. A giant scorpion moved nearby, its many legs brushing the ground in silence. It didn't see the amphibian, but the danger was always present. One wrong move, one loud breath, and the hunter would become the hunted. This was the challenge of life on land. There were no safe places, only moments of quiet between bursts of fear and hunger. Still, the amphibians survived, and they grew. Some learned to crawl farther from water. Some laid eggs in hidden, wetter places under leaves or near puddles. Their legs got stronger, their skin thicker, their senses sharper. They were not fully land animals yet, but they were getting closer. The forests were changing, and they were changing with it. Even though they were not as large as the giant insects, amphibians were important. They were the link between fish and the reptiles that would come later. They were the first to try a new kind of life. And though many of them would vanish with time, their story would stay written in stone. Fossils buried in old swamp beds, bones turned to rock, footprints pressed into ancient mud. These small steps left marks that would last longer than their lives. As the sun rose again, lighting the tops of the trees in soft gold, another amphibian crawled from the edge of a quiet stream. Its skin was damp. Its eyes were bright. It looked around, sniffed the air, and took another step onto the forest floor. In that simple motion, it was doing something no creature had done for most of Earth's history. It was walking into the future. A slow wind moved through the forest, brushing against the tall ferns and soft-trunked trees. carrying the heavy smell of wet earth and old leaves. Water dripped from vine to vine, making soft tapping sounds as it fell onto the spongy ground. Somewhere in the green silence, something new was being born, not with a shout or a roar, but with a quiet change no one could see. An egg, lying in a patch of warm moss, cracked open. Not in water, not near a stream. This egg had a shell, and what came out of it did not need to swim. It did not need to rush back to the safety of a pond or swamp. It breathed air, blinked against the light, and stepped forward on four dry feet. It was a reptile. And though it was small, maybe no longer than your hand, it was part of something very big. Until now, most animals that lived on land still needed water to have babies. Their eggs were soft and had to stay wet. If they dried out, the baby inside would die. But this new kind of egg was different. It had layers, a shell to keep out the dry air, a watery space inside to protect the growing baby. It was like a tiny world of its own, holding everything the new life needed until it was strong enough to crawl out. This egg didn't need a pond. It didn't need the swamp. It needed only a safe place, some warmth, and time. This changed everything. Now, animals could lay their eggs on dry land and walk away. They could explore farther, live in new places, and stay away from the dangers of water. This new kind of life, reptile life, was more free. It was more bold, and it was ready to spread. In one corner of the forest, under the arching arms of tall seed ferns, a group of early reptiles moved slowly through the thick leaf litter. Their bodies were low to the ground, their legs sticking out to the sides, but stronger than those of amphibians. Their skin was dry and scaly, not wet and soft. Sunlight touched their backs through the ferns above. They paused often to look, sniff, or listen, using sharp senses to stay safe. These reptiles were small, fast, and careful. Some ate insects. Some ate plants. A few were hunters, watching from shadows and waiting to strike. One of these reptiles crept near a fallen log, its nose twitching, its tongue flicking the air. It was hunting. A bug, perhaps, or a tiny frog. Its claws curled slightly as it moved forward. Then, in a flash, it snapped its jaws shut and swallowed. The moment passed, and it kept moving. Not loud, not fast, but steady. These were not rulers of the land yet, but they were ready to try. Their eggs, tucked away beneath warm layers of leaf mold, waited quietly in the dirt, safe from drying out, safe from drowning. These animals did not live in big groups. They didn't have mothers watching over them. Each baby hatched alone and learned quickly. Run, hide, eat, grow. That was the way. And because of this, only the strongest survived. But each new reptile was a traveler, a pioneer. It moved away from the swampy edges and into new places where few others dared to go. The reptiles weren't giants. Not yet. Many were no bigger than a lizard. But they didn't need to be big. They only needed to be tough. Their legs grew stronger. Their lungs pulled in air with more power. Their skin lost the need for water. And soon, they were walking in places where even the largest insects could not follow. They climbed rocky slopes. They crossed dry plains. They lived in parts of the forest that were higher, cooler, and brighter. They were finding a new way to live. One early reptile, Hylonomus, left footprints in soft mud that hardened into stone over millions of years. It was small, maybe 8 inches long, with sharp teeth and a long tail, but it carried the future in its steps. Where it walked, others would follow. Bigger reptiles, faster ones, some that walked on 2 legs, some that would grow armor, horns, or teeth the size of knives. But all of that was still far away. For now, Hylonomus walked carefully through ferns and moss, looking for insects to eat and a safe place to rest. Rain still came often. The forest was still wet, thick, and full of fog. But these reptiles didn't fear the rain. They didn't slip back into the water. They stayed on land, shaking off drops and crawling under ferns to wait for sun. Their world was growing bigger with every egg that hatched far from the water's edge. In one clearing, warm and quiet, a mother reptile scraped a shallow hole with her hind legs. She laid a small clutch of eggs, each one no bigger than a thumb. Then she covered them with soft dirt and leaves, pushing carefully with her nose. When she was done, she walked away. The eggs would hatch alone, but they were safe. Safe from drying air, safe from drowning, safe from the old rules of the swamp. This was how the future began. Not with a bang, but with a shell. Not with thunder, but with the quiet cracking of eggs in warm dirt. Reptiles did not need loud songs or giant bodies to take over the land. They only needed to break free from water and carry their young in tiny, protected worlds. And once they did that, there was no going back. The forest was still full of buzzing insects, huge ferns, and shallow pools. But something was changing. The reptiles were rising. They didn't need to stay close to water. They didn't need to return to lay their eggs. They had the power to leave the swamps behind. And though the trees didn't notice, and the insects didn't care, the ground itself remembered. In fossil beds deep beneath our feet, the footprints of those first dryland walkers still lie pressed in stone, telling the quiet beginning of a new age. The sky over the forest was never bright blue. It stayed gray, heavy, and full of clouds that moved like slow waves. Sunlight was weak and soft, slipping through the mist in pale strips that touched the tops of trees but barely reached the ground. The air felt thick, almost like breathing through a damp cloth. It was heavy with oxygen, more than twice as much as today. That might sound like a good thing, but too much of anything can change everything. The forest was green and alive, but it was also on edge like a match sitting too close to fire. Insects ruled the air. One of the biggest, a dragonfly called Meganura, had wings that stretched more than 2 feet across. Its body, long and jointed, glistened in the misty light as it flew between the trees. The sound of its wings deep and sharp like a saw blade. It didn't flap quickly like a modern fly. It moved with power, gliding from branch to branch in slow, steady beats. It needed that thick air to stay aloft, to feed its huge body. If it flew in today's skies, it would fall. But in the Carboniferous world, the air itself held it up. On the forest floor, creatures crawled and clung to roots and logs. Millipedes the size of snakes slid through fallen leaves. Scorpions longer than your arm watched from under rocks. Every breath brought in more oxygen than needed, filling blood and muscle with extra energy. Bugs didn't just grow big, they burned hot, their bodies made for motion and speed. But this power came with risk. Too much oxygen made everything easier to light. A dry leaf, a dead tree, a patch of moss warmed by the sun, fire didn't need much. And once it started, it didn't stop. The forest, soaked as it often was, still had dry moments. A few days without rain, a breeze too strong, a fallen tree struck by lightning. The spark would catch in the brush and climb up vines. Soon, the soft bark of the giant club mosses would crackle and spit out flames. Fires roared through the undergrowth with a sound like wind and teeth. Leaves curled, blackened, and vanished. Tree trunks hissed as water boiled inside them. Insects fled in clouds, or dropped, burning. Smoke rose in long, dark ropes into the gray sky. And beneath the flames, animals ran, or didn't. Some fires stayed small. Others swallowed whole parts of the forest, burning until the rain returned. The ground turned to ash, black and soft, and the smell of smoke hung in the air for days. But even this was part of the Carboniferous world. Fire cleared space. It opened patches of sunlight. It made room for new plants to grow. The forest didn't fear fire. It folded it into its rhythm. But fire wasn't the only danger. The world itself was shifting, and not just in the trees. Far beneath the ground, the continents were moving. Slow as it was, they crept together, inch by inch, year by year, pushed by forces no creature could see. Swamps sank. Rivers changed course. Mountains began to rise where once there was flat land. The air grew colder in some places, drier in others. Rainfall dropped. The wet, swampy forests that had ruled the earth for millions of years began to shrink, just a little at first. The change wasn't loud. It didn't shout. It whispered. But the creatures who depended on the swamps, who needed wet ground, thick air, and warm nights, started to struggle. The giant insects that had once soared found it harder to breathe. Without enough oxygen, their bodies could not work. They grew smaller, slower, and fewer. The great dragonflies vanished from many skies. The massive millipedes and scorpions shrank. Some disappeared completely. The fire-loving, oxygen-rich world that had once lifted them up was starting to slip away. In a part of the forest where the trees still stood tall, a dragonfly clung to a branch, its body tired, its wings dull. The air was changing. It was still thick, but not thick enough. Below, the ground was drier than usual. The moss had turned pale. The water in the stream had sunk low, barely moving. The insects buzzed less. The wind blew harder. The dragonfly waited. But waiting would not change what was coming. In the distance, clouds built again. Not the soft, wet ones of summer, but heavy, cold ones. They came with wind, not warmth. And they stayed longer than before. Months, then years. The cycle of the world was shifting. The continents were now close enough to form something new, something massive. A supercontinent was forming, pulling land together into one giant stretch, and this new land was drier, rougher, and less kind to the creatures that once ruled the swampy world. The forests didn't fall in a single day. They shrank. Bit by bit, the great green blanket that had once stretched across the land grew patchy and thin. Coal swamps dried out. Trees died standing, their roots cracking in the hardening soil. Amphibians, once brave walkers of land, found fewer places to lay their eggs. Reptiles, with their tough skin and shell-covered eggs, were better suited for this drier land. They moved in where others failed. They didn't just survive, they began to take over. Still, the forest tried to hold on. In the deepest valleys, where fog still hugged the ground and rivers still ran strong, small corners of the old world remained. But they were quiet now. The giant insects were gone. The dragonflies that zipped past were small. The scorpions no longer towered. What had once seemed endless now felt like memory. The air itself remembered. The oxygen dropped slowly, but it dropped. Fires grew smaller. Life slowed down. The sky lightened. And in the new stillness, a different sound began to rise. The dry scratch of reptile claws across sun-baked dirt. The Carboniferous world wasn't ending in a crash. It was dimming, shifting, letting go. And from its fading breath, a new world would rise. One with deserts, with sharp-toothed reptiles, and skies no longer built for flying giants. But the roots of that new world still ran through the old. Every coal seam, every fossil, every layer of ash and stone. They told the story of a world that burned too bright, too fast, and left behind the spark for what would come next. In the quiet shadow of a dying forest, the last echoes of the Carboniferous world whispered through the leaves. The trees stood tall, but tired, their green crowns thinner than before, their bark dry and flaking. Beneath them, the ground was cracked in places where it had once been soaked in moss. Pools that had once mirrored the canopy now lay empty, or filled only with mud that had hardened like stone. It was a strange stillness. The air no longer smelled rich and full. It carried a sharpness, a dryness that didn't belong to swamps. Something deep in the planet had shifted. The land was rising, folding, and stretching toward the sky. The air was thinning. The warmth was fading. The age of endless green was slipping away. Far from this quiet corner, mountains were rising, pushed upward by great forces beneath the earth. These new heights cut through the clouds, blocking rain that had once fallen freely across the land. Dry winds swept down their slopes, carrying dust into places where ferns had once grown wild. Rivers dried out, swamps turned into plains, and with each year, the carbon-filled breath of the Carboniferous forest faded a little more. The air, once rich in oxygen, began to lose its weight. It was still breathable, still alive. But it no longer filled the lungs with fire. It no longer lifted giant insects into the sky. Insects, once the rulers of the trees and the air, began to shrink. Meganura, the mighty dragonfly with wings like window shutters, no longer soared in the open canopy. The air could no longer carry it. Its young were fewer, its wings weaker. In time, it was gone. Not in a crash or a battle, but in silence. Other giants followed, the millipedes that curled like logs, the scorpions with claws like daggers, the strange beetles the size of dinner plates. They shrank or vanished, their bodies too large for the thinning air, too slow for the changing land. But the forest didn't just lose its insects, it lost its heart. The great trees, once thick with sap and covered in bark like armor, stopped growing. They needed wet soil. They needed steady heat. Now they had dry wind and colder nights. Their roots, once strong enough to hold up a city, cracked in the hardening earth. Some trees fell where they stood. Others simply stopped, frozen in time, their green turning dull. They left behind logs that no longer rotted as quickly, that sat half buried in dust instead of sinking into rich swamp mud. The forest was still here, but it was not the same. Amphibians, too, began to feel the change. These soft-skinned wanderers had once thrived in the damp corners of the world. They hunted in the fog and sang in the ponds. But now, the ponds were fewer. The fog didn't stay as long. The ground where they laid their eggs cracked instead of sinking. Their babies, once born in water, now dried out before they could swim. Their skin, made for wet places, baked in the sun. They tried to follow the last of the water, hiding in valleys and shady creeks. But even there, the warmth didn't last. Ice touched the land in strange ways. Nights came colder than before. The world had turned, and they couldn't follow fast enough. In one corner of the land, beneath a short ridge where a thin stream still flowed, an old amphibian lay hidden beneath a root. Its body was slow. Its eyes blinked once, then stayed closed for a long time. It was waiting for rain that wouldn't come. It had once hunted here, once raised young in the shallows. Now it just waited, its breaths growing slower. Around it, the ground dried and cracked. The stream shrank to a trickle, and still it lay there, holding on. But even the strongest lungs cannot beat a world that no longer matches your shape. Reptiles, with their dry skin and strong lungs, were doing better. They walked the drying earth with steady steps. They didn't need swamps. They didn't need wet air. Their eggs, sealed in tough shells, waited safely in warm nests, far from any pond. These were creatures made for the new world, and though the wittiest, they were still small, they were spreading. One step at a time, they were filling the empty spaces left by creatures that had needed too much. The forest didn't end in flames. It didn't fall in a storm. It thinned. It faded. Its green turned brown. Its leaves stopped growing. And when they fell, they didn't always return. The thick layers of leaf litter grew thinner. The spongy ground turned hard. The strange breathing hush of the swamp was replaced by stillness, a silence that felt too wide, too open. The songs of insects faded. The splash of frogs was gone. And above, the sky, once thick with mist, looked clearer now, sharper, higher, colder. But even now, even in its final breath, the Carboniferous world gave something more. Beneath the ground, in the old layers of rotting wood and fallen leaves, coal was still forming. It was darker than before, pressed tighter, deeper. It was the last gift of a forest that had fed the air, the land, and the sea. That coal would wait in silence, tucked beneath the crust of the earth, ready to be found by hands that had not yet evolved, in a time no one could yet imagine. Above that buried treasure, the last forest stood like ghosts, thin, quiet, fading. Each leaf that fell felt like a farewell, not just to a tree, but to an age of green giants, of giant bugs, of fire and steam and sky. The Carboniferous was not gone in one heartbeat, but it was going, and with each step, the planet itself seemed to prepare for something new. The air shifted, the rains paused, the fires cooled, and a silence hung over the land, heavy and strange. But if you listened close, deep below the still roots, you might hear something stirring, something not yet born, something watching the old world fade and waiting for its turn to rise. Beneath the surface of the earth, deep down where sunlight had never reached, something waited. It wasn't alive, but it held the memory of life. A thick black band ran through the stone, a line of coal pressed tight between layers of shale and sandstone. It looked like a scar, a dark stripe in the body of the planet. But it wasn't a wound. It was a fossil, not of a creature, but of a forest, a whole world, crushed and hidden, now turned to fuel. Millions of years ago, that band had been ferns and trees, moss and bark, roots and leaves. Now it was carbon, hard and shiny, locked in silence. The forest was gone, but it had left behind its breath. All across the old continents, these black seams crisscrossed the earth like a secret code. Some were only a few inches thick. Others stretched over 6 feet deep. They ran for miles, bending and folding with the land, buried under hills, trapped inside mountains. Coal didn't shout like a fossil tooth or a bone. It didn't sparkle like gold or glow like crystal. But it had power. Not just heat, not just fire, but the power to tell a story. The story of the Carboniferous world, told not in words, but in pressure and ash. Long before humans stood upright or built cities, they found coal. Sometimes it broke loose from the sides of cliffs or washed up in riverbeds. It was black and soft, easy to burn, hot and smoky. People didn't know what it was at first. They only knew it burned better than wood. In cold places, it gave warmth. In dark caves, it gave light. But they didn't know the secret inside, that they were holding a piece of a forest from 300 million years ago. Later, as time passed and tools sharpened, humans began to dig. They carved into hillsides, burrowed into the earth, chasing the black lines wherever they led. Coal became more than heat. It became power. Machines came to life, running on steam made from burning forests that had long turned to stone. Trains crossed lands. Ships crossed seas. Cities rose. All of it fed by a world that no longer existed. Every puff of smoke, every spark of fire, was a whisper from the Carboniferous. But coal was not silent. It brought danger too. In the deep mines, gas filled the tunnels. It didn't smell, but it waited. A single spark could turn the air into fire. Men carried canaries in cages, tiny birds with fast breaths. If the bird fell silent, the men knew to run. The forest, even buried, still had teeth, and coal dust, black and fine, coated lungs, slowly turning breath into struggle. The cost of burning the past was paid in coughs and silence. Still, the digging continued. Mountains were carved open. Rivers were rerouted. Whole valleys were emptied to reach the black seams below. Coal lit up the night. It pushed factory wheels and iron trains. It turned cities into giants. But each flame ate away at the past, piece by piece. And as the world grew brighter, the memory of the old forest grew thinner. Sometimes, deep in a mine wall, a shape would appear. Not coal, not rock, but the ghost of a leaf, pressed into stone like a shadow. A fern, long extinct. A root, frozen mid-grow. Sometimes even a wing, thin and fragile, left behind by an insect that once flew through the heavy air. These fossils didn't burn. They told stories. A miner might stop, wipe his hand across the stone, and for a moment, the machine would be quiet, just long enough to wonder what kind of world this was before it turned dark and hard. That world was not silent. It buzzed and hissed, clicked and creaked. It steamed, it flamed, it lived in layers. But it did not last. The swamp dried. The giants fell. The sky changed. And the land swallowed the forest, 1 year at a time. But Earth never forgets. The Carboniferous didn't disappear. It sank. Now, when coal is burned, the sky remembers. The air takes in the carbon, the same that once fed the ferns and trees. The cycle spins again. But it spins faster now. Too fast. The balance that once let dragonflies grow huge and forests stretch across the land is tipping. The earth warms, the ice melts, the oceans rise, all because of a forest that once lived and now burns. But even in change, there is wonder. That a tree from 300 million years ago can light a room today, that a leaf pressed in stone can show us a time before flowers, before birds, before people, that the breath of the past still moves in the wind today. These are not just facts. They are threads, threads that tie us to the deep time of the planet, threads that remind us we are not separate from the earth, but part of its long, unfolding story. And if we listen, really listen, to the coal crackling in a fire, to the machines humming with ancient power, to the wind carrying the last of the smoke, we might hear it speak. Not in words, but in memory. The Carboniferous is not just a chapter in a book. It is a root beneath our feet, a pulse in the stone, a shadow in the fire. The world we know was built on a world we never saw. A green world, wide and wild. A world of giants and stillness, of fire and fog. And though that world is gone, its bones warm our homes, light our streets, and fuel our questions. What came before us? What will come after? The coal does not answer, but it reminds us that Earth remembers everything. In a quiet valley where the wind barely moved and the trees leaned like sleepy giants, a layer of black rock pressed tightly beneath the soil. It wasn't just any rock, it was made of life, of trees and ferns, roots and bark, leaves and stems, all crushed, buried, and changed over millions of years. This place had once been a swamp, full of buzzing insects and rising steam. But now, it held only stillness. The ground didn't sink like it used to. The air didn't hum with dragonfly wings. Even the birds flying high above knew nothing of the world that once lived here. A narrow stream trickled over rocks, its water clear but cold. The banks were dry, the moss pale. A small reptile, no longer than a shoe, stepped carefully over the stones, its claws clicking softly. It stopped to sniff the air. It smelled dust. Not flowers, not swamp water, just dry, tired earth. It blinked once and crawled forward, unaware that it walked on the remains of trees taller than any still standing. Its tiny shadow stretched over roots turned to stone, old forest paths buried and forgotten. In the cliffs beyond the valley, dark stripes cut across the face of the rock. Each stripe was a memory, a line where the old forest had lived, died, and turned to coal. Some stripes were thin, only a few inches wide. Others were thick enough to hold the shape of ferns, bark, even insects. If you ran your hand across the rock, you could feel the bumps where leaves had once curled. The patterns were soft, like the edge of a dream. They didn't sparkle, they didn't shine, but they held stories deeper than words. Storm clouds rolled across the sky, heavy and gray. Rain began to fall, slow and steady. Drops hit the leaves with soft plinks. The air smelled sharp and clean. The reptile darted under a log, curling its body tight. Lightning flashed in the distance, followed by a low rumble that rolled across the hills like a slow drum. Rainwater seeped into the cracks of the rock. Over time, years, centuries, it would wear those rocks down, uncovering more pieces of the forest below. A long time later, not in days or months, but thousands of years, a new kind of creature arrived in the valley. It walked upright. It carried tools. Its eyes were bright and full of questions. It saw the black rock in the cliffs and felt its weight. It broke a piece off and smelled it. It felt oily, strange, old. Then it lit it. The coal caught fire. Orange flames danced in the wind. The fire gave light. Heat. A story. A power the creature didn't fully understand. More time passed. More creatures came. They dug into the cliff. They pulled out the coal. They built with it. They changed the valley. Trees were cut. Rivers moved. The ground shook with machines. The quiet was gone. The stream no longer trickled. It ran black. The air, once sharp with rain, now smelled like smoke. But in the dust and the noise, something stirred. A layer of stone broke away, and behind it, a perfect fern leaf was pressed into the wall, its edges clear, its shape full. It looked like it had just fallen yesterday. A child with muddy hands reached out and touched it. He didn't know it was 300 million years old. He didn't know it had once breathed air thick with oxygen, under trees so tall they blocked the sky. He only knew it looked like a plant, but made of stone. His fingers traced the veins of the leaf. It felt cool and smooth. He didn't speak. He just stared. And in that moment, the story of the Carboniferous wasn't gone. It was seen, felt, known, in a way too deep for words. Back on the hills, where grass now grew in thin patches and wind carved soft grooves in the dirt, nothing looked ancient. But if you dug just a few feet down, you'd find it. The coal, the fossils, the layers of time, one on top of the other like pages in a book. Some pages were blank. Others were written in ferns, in soot, in ash. All of them waiting. Elsewhere, in a glass case in a city museum, a piece of fossil bark sat under bright lights. People walked past, glanced at it, moved on. But one boy stopped. He leaned in. The bark had little diamond shapes pressed into it. It didn't look like bark from trees today. It looked like a puzzle. He read the small sign, Lepidodendron, Carboniferous period. He whispered the words to himself, Carboniferous. It sounded like a magic word. His eyes stayed on the fossil, as the noise of the museum buzzed behind him. Outside the museum, cars moved fast. Lights blinked red, yellow, green. People hurried under gray skies. None of them thought about the forest that once covered the world. They didn't know their city stood on top of old swamps, that the power they used, the heat in their homes, came from the breath of ferns and the bodies of bugs that had lived before even the dinosaurs. But the world remembered. Beneath the sidewalks, the soil still held the black fingerprints of the Carboniferous. The past does not stay buried forever. Sometimes it rises in smoke, sometimes in stone, sometimes in silence, and sometimes in the still moment when someone stops to wonder, when they hold a black rock in their hand, feel its weight and ask, where did this come from? What lived here before me? What stories are still hiding under my feet? In that moment, the old forest stirs again. The dragonflies rise, the ferns uncurl, the swamps steam, and for just a second, the Carboniferous world breathes once more. Not in fire or fog, but in memory. Long after the forest sank and the ferns turned to coal, the earth kept turning. The sky, once thick with steam and mist, began to stretch wider and clearer. The air grew cooler, the ground changed color. Brown mud hardened into red rock, black swamps dried and cracked. New kinds of trees crept in, smaller, sharper, and fewer. They weren't like the ones from before. Their trunks were tougher, their leaves needle-thin. The old giants were gone, and a new kind of plant had begun to rise. And beneath this changing surface, something very strange had already begun. Something with bones, with shells, with sharp eyes that blinked against the sun. The Carboniferous world had given rise to many kinds of life, but its ending gave rise to something different. In the deep, dark corners of the swamps, before they dried up, a few small creatures had learned a new trick. They laid eggs that didn't need water. Eggs with shells. Eggs that could sit on land and still keep the baby inside safe. These were not fish. They were not frogs. They were the first reptiles. And they were ready for a world that was becoming drier, cooler, and harsher. One of these reptiles, no longer than a ruler, stepped across a patch of cracked earth. Its skin was rough like old bark, its toes spread wide to hold its weight. It blinked slowly in the pale morning light. Around it, the forest was thinner than before. No giant dragonflies hummed overhead. No steam curled up from the ground. The air felt sharp, but the little reptile didn't mind. This world suited it. It didn't need puddles to lay eggs. It didn't need thick fog to breathe. It just needed sunlight, a dry patch of dirt, and quiet. Farther down the hillside, other reptiles crept and scurried. Some ate bugs. Some ate plants. Some hunted the smaller ones. They were not fast. They were not large. But they were patient. The air that once lifted giant insects now carried smaller wings. And the ground, which had once swallowed the feet of heavy trees, now held firm for claws and scales. It was a world that moved slower, but more carefully, and the reptiles fit right in. Every few weeks the sun would shine a little less. The winds would turn colder. It wasn't an ice age yet. Not truly, but the chill was growing. The trees dropped their leaves early. Rain came less often. Nights stretched longer, and the swamps that once sang with the buzz of life now stood silent. But silence wasn't empty. It meant something was waiting, changing, getting ready. In the shadows of a small ridge, under a flat rock warmed by the sun, a cluster of eggs rested. Their shells were dry, hard, speckled with tiny dots. Inside, the babies were growing. Tiny claws, small hearts, little eyes still closed. They would not swim, they would walk, and they would not breathe underwater. They would breathe dry air. These eggs were the future, shaped by the ending of the past. Meanwhile, the land itself moved, not quickly, but with deep power. The great plates of the earth slid toward each other. Continents met. Mountains rose higher. The sea pulled back in some places and spilled into others. What had once been many small landmasses was slowly becoming one, a supercontinent, huge, harsh, unforgiving, and at its center, the last whispers of the Carboniferous were fading like a breath in cold air. The coal left behind didn't notice. It just sat in layers, black and heavy. But the reptiles above didn't know coal existed. They only knew that the ground was dry, and the wind was cold, and they had to keep moving. The world was not done changing, and neither were they. Some reptiles found caves to hide from the chill. Others burrowed beneath fallen logs. Some grew tougher scales. Some laid more eggs. Many didn't survive. But those who did passed on their strength, their hard shells, their steady lungs, their sharp eyes. Over thousands of years, these tiny changes built creatures that could walk farther, eat more, hide better, and wait longer. The swamp dwellers of the past had given way to the wanderers of a drier, colder earth. The plants changed too. The giant ferns didn't come back. But conifers, with their strong, pointy leaves, began to spread. They didn't need swampy ground. They didn't need gentle rain. They could stand against wind and cold. Their seeds didn't float. They flew. And where they landed, they grew quickly. Not into giants, but into forests that could survive in a changing world. The Carboniferous had ended quietly, but not without leaving something behind. In its coal, it stored the memory of green breath. In its fossils, it left the shapes of forgotten life. But in its ending, it gave birth to something new. Reptiles that didn't need water, trees that didn't need fog, and a planet that was ready to try something different. The sky now stretched clearer than before. The clouds moved faster. The storms hit harder. But life didn't stop. It just bent, shifted, adapted. And one by one, the creatures of the Carboniferous faded into memory, while the ones built for the next age began to rise. In a small patch of sunlight, a baby reptile cracked open its egg. It blinked at the dry air, stretched its legs, and stepped forward into a world with no dragons, no towering trees, no endless swamps. It didn't miss them. It had never known them, but it walked across the earth they had built. Every step pressed down on ancient roots. Every breath carried atoms from ferns long gone. And every heartbeat beat in time with a story that had started long before it was born and would not end here. The Carboniferous was over, but its children were just getting started. In a quiet corner of the earth, far from any city, the wind blew across a wide field of broken stone. The rocks were dark, hard, and layered in thin sheets. Some pieces were smooth, others cracked like dry skin. One small ridge jutted up from the ground, like a frozen wave, its edges sharp, and right through the middle of it ran a black stripe. Not paint, not dirt. Coal, a piece of the ancient world, still waiting, still holding the memory of a time long gone. You couldn't see it from far away, but up close, it told a story hidden in silence and stone. If you picked up a chunk of that coal and looked closely, you might see something strange. A pattern, a mark, a shape that looked almost like a leaf. It wasn't painted. It wasn't carved. It had been pressed there by time itself, by the weight of the world and the breath of the forest that came before. A fern, with soft arms curled like tiny green hands, once grew where your fingers now touched. It reached for sunlight in a swamp that no longer existed, and now its shape was locked in black stone, dark as night, but full of memory. Elsewhere, a deep mine carved into the earth. Machines buzzed, lights blinked, and dust floated like smoke in the air. Workers in helmets chipped at walls, loading chunks of coal onto belts. Each piece dropped with a soft thud, landing in a pile that would later feed engines and homes. But no one spoke of the forest. No one whispered about the dragonflies, the towering trees, or the steam rising from ferns taller than houses. And yet all of it was still there, hidden in the blackness, sealed away like treasure in a vault. In a science lab, far from the mine, a young girl looked through a microscope. On the glass slide sat a thin slice of fossil wood, polished smooth. She turned the focus knob slowly. The lines came into view. Tight rings, dark shapes, tiny vessels that once carried water and sunlight through a living tree. She blinked. It looked like a maze, like veins in a hand. Her teacher said this was lepidodendron, a tree from the Carboniferous. She said these trees once reached over 100 feet high and grew faster than any plant alive today. The girl looked again. It didn't look fast. It looked still. But deep inside, she felt a tiny hum, a sense that something very old was speaking to her. Not in words, in pattern, in shape, in silence. That silence stretched across the planet. In riverbeds, cliff walls, deep valleys, coal seams still slept. Some had been found. Many had not. Some held perfect fossils. Others were plain, just black rock. But all of it told the same story. That once, long ago, Earth was green in ways we cannot imagine. That air was so rich in oxygen, it could catch fire with a single spark. That forests rose and fell, not over centuries, but in pulses, fast, lush, wild. And that the life we now know, flowers, birds, people, was not even a dream yet. In some places, rain still falls on land that once was carboniferous swamp. You can't tell by looking. The trees are different. The bugs are smaller. The sounds are quieter. But if you dig deep enough, past clay, past roots, past gravel and stone, you reach the layer, the black layer. It doesn't shine, but it waits. And every time it is touched, it whispers the same thing. We were here. We lived. We breathed. In a museum across the sea, a child pressed his nose to the glass. Inside the case was a slab of stone with a perfect fossil insect. Its wings were long and clear, laced with thin veins. The sign said Meganeura, a dragonfly from the Carboniferous. Wingspan, 28 inches. He held his arms out wide to match the size. A bug as big as a hawk. He shook his head. It didn't seem real, but it was. That bug had once soared through a sky thick with steam, through forests of trees that no longer stood. He wondered what it felt like to live in that world, what the air smelled like, what sounds the swamp made at night. He wanted to know. In that moment, the past reached through glass and stone and time. It touched him, and without knowing how, he became part of the story too. Back on the hillside, the wind picked up. Dry leaves spun across the ground. A single bird cried out overhead. It was fall. The trees, small and rough, dropped their orange leaves onto the dirt. Nothing in this place looked like a carboniferous forest. But beneath the roots, the coal still rested. It didn't need light. It didn't need sound. It had time. And it was waiting. Because the Carboniferous was not just an age. It was a gift. A message buried in black rock. A memory sealed in stone. A pulse that still beats even when no one hears it. And when someone, someday, holds a piece of coal in their hand and wonders where it came from, the story will rise again. Not as smoke, not as heat, but as a picture in their mind. Of ferns tall as buildings, of bugs with wings wide as arms, of forests so thick the sun could barely break through, and of a planet learning to breathe for the very first time. The old swamp was gone. No ferns stood tall. No dragonflies floated like kites through thick, wet air. But even after 300 million years, the world still carried pieces of it. In coal, in fossils, in the air itself. You couldn't see the Carboniferous anymore, but its fingerprints were everywhere, and the earth remembered it, not just in rock and stone, but in the shape of life, the way forests grow, the way we breathe, and the fire we use to build our world. High in a laboratory on a quiet hill, a group of scientists stood around a flat table. In the middle was a chunk of rock, black and shiny. It looked like just a lump of coal, but this one had something inside it, something rare. A leaf so perfectly pressed into the stone, it looked like it had just fallen yesterday. Its edges were sharp, the veins clear, like rivers drawn by the wind. It wasn't a common leaf. It belonged to a tree that hadn't grown in hundreds of millions of years. One of the scientists pointed to a small mark along the stem and said, "This might be Alethopteris." The others leaned in, careful not to breathe too hard. They knew what they were seeing wasn't just a fossil. It was a message, a moment frozen in pressure and heat. Far away, in a classroom with bright posters and rows of desks, a teacher rolled down a large chart. It showed all the periods of Earth's history: Cambrian, Devonian, Carboniferous, and so on. A small boy raised his hand and asked, "What was it like back then?" The teacher smiled and said, "Imagine a world without flowers. No grass, no birds, no people, just trees that don't look like trees. Giant insects, wet air, and swamps that stretch for miles." The room went quiet for a second. Then another hand went up. "Were the animals scary?" The teacher nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "And beautiful." That word, beautiful, carried across the years. Because even though the Carboniferous was full of strange and wild things, there was something lovely in how it all fit together. The trees fed the air fed the bugs fed the reptiles, and the dead fed the earth. Every layer, every breath, every falling leaf added to something bigger, something lasting. It was not a clean world. It was messy, loud, wet. But it was alive in a way the earth had never seen before. Back underground, in tunnels that twisted like wormholes beneath the surface, a miner wiped coal dust from his face. He leaned against the wall and took a breath. His lamp flickered, lighting up a thin crack in the stone. He touched it with his glove and felt the edge of something. A line, a shape. He cleared it gently. A pattern appeared, like lace, like the imprint of a plant. He didn't know what it was called. He just knew it was old, older than anything. He stood there in silence, the hum of machines around him, and for a moment he was part of it. The past, the forest, the world before. Up above, a river flowed over smooth rocks. Its water shimmered in the sun. On its banks grew trees with sharp leaves, nothing like the soft green fronds of the Carboniferous. But the ground beneath them was thick with stories. Somewhere down below, still buried deep, was a tree trunk turned to coal, a dragonfly wing pressed into mud, a root that once drank from a swamp that no longer existed. The river did not know, the trees did not know, but the earth held it all. In a library, a young girl flipped through the pages of a giant science book. Her finger stopped on a picture of a world covered in moss and mist. She saw a strange plant with cone-like tips and trunks that looked like scaly rope. She read the caption, Lycopods, giant club mosses that could grow over 100 feet tall. She tried to imagine a forest where these were the tallest things alive. No flowers, no fruit, just towering, sponge-like trunks and a floor thick with wet roots. She didn't know it yet, but something in her had just changed. A seed had been planted, not the kind that grows into a tree, but one that grows into a question, because that's what the Carboniferous gives us now. Not just coal, not just fossils, but questions. What made insects grow so big? Why did the forests fall? How did the first reptiles leave the water behind? What happens when the world holds too much carbon, then locks it away? And, most important, what will we do with what the Carboniferous left behind? The Earth is different now. The swamps are gone. The air is drier. The trees are smaller. But the fire still burns. In stoves, in engines, in the bright glow of city lights. And every time coal is burned, a little part of that ancient world returns, not as plants or animals, but as heat, as energy, as memory. We live on top of that memory. Our roads cross the buried trunks of ancient forests. Our homes sit above the wings of bugs that once ruled the skies. Our machines run on the breath of plants that died before anything we know was alive. And the more we learn about that world, the more we understand our own. In a museum hallway, a fossil wall stood tall and still. People passed by, talking and laughing. But one boy stood alone, staring at a fern pressed into stone. He didn't move. He didn't blink. In his mind, he saw the forest. He felt the air grow thick and hot. He heard the buzz of wings and the soft splash of something moving through shallow water. He reached out and touched the glass. The fern didn't move, but in that second, the Carboniferous lived again. Not through science, not through fire, but through wonder. And wonder is what keeps the past alive. The rain fell softly over the hills, painting the dirt dark and wet. A fog rolled low across the ground, curling between the tree trunks like steam from a forgotten world. The trees here were sharp and thin, nothing like the ancient giants that once ruled the Carboniferous. Their bark was rough, their branches narrow, and their leaves barely moved in the wind. But beneath this quiet forest floor, below the roots and rocks, the story of the past still slept. Black layers of coal waited in silence, made from trees that no longer had names. Fossils shaped like feathers, shells, and wings rested in the dark, pressed flat by time and heat. They did not shine. They did not move. But they were not gone. A boy walked along a muddy path, boots sinking with each step. He carried a small notebook and a flashlight. He had heard stories about this place, how old it was, how deep the earth went here. His science teacher had told him, this was once a swamp, one of the biggest on Earth, long before the dinosaurs. At first, he didn't believe it, but now, as he walked, he felt something, not fear, not wonder, a quiet pull, like the land itself was remembering. He reached a broken cliff wall, where a layer of dark rock peeked out like the edge of a book. He leaned close. With his fingers, he brushed away the dirt. A shape appeared, long, thin, curved. It looked like a stem, or a root, or maybe the body of a bug. He wasn't sure, but it was perfect, as if it had been waiting just for him. Back in the city, people hurried through the rain. Their coats flapped, their umbrellas bumped. They didn't think about ancient forests or giant insects. They thought about time, traffic, noise. They lived in a world built on speed and light. But even their world ran on the Carboniferous. The trains, the buses, the power in the street lamps. It all came from coal, from the breath of trees that lived before anything human had a name. They didn't know, but they felt it, in the warmth of their homes, in the glow of their screens, in the hum of the life around them. A coal plant buzzed quietly on the edge of a river. Towers stood tall, gray smoke drifting into the sky. Inside, giant machines turned black rock into heat, into light, into the pulse of a modern world. But no one saw the fern inside the coal, the bark, the seed, the dragonfly. They were there, burned into the fuel, turning ancient forests into sparks. Far away, in a quiet museum room, a girl stood in front of a large display. It showed a full-sized model of a carboniferous forest. The trees were tall and soft-looking. The bugs had strange shapes. The light was green and thick. She reached out, almost as if to touch it, but her hand stopped on the glass. She stared, and slowly she smiled, not because she understood it all, but because she felt something deep and old and beautiful, something real. The Carboniferous was not a time full of stories. It was not a time of kings or cities or books, but it gave the world its breath, its coal, its pattern. It gave the earth deep roots, and every time we learn more about it, we understand more about ourselves. Because the air we breathe, the energy we use, the shape of our forests, all of it carries the fingerprint of that world, the world of steam and swamp, of ferns and fire, of first reptiles and final dragonflies. A boy at home opened a book and saw a photo of a tree trunk fossil with diamond shapes in its bark. He traced the pattern with his finger. He didn't know what it was called, but he whispered the name written below the image. Sigillaria. The word felt strange on his tongue, like a spell or a secret. And in that whisper, something stirred. In a research lab across the ocean, a scientist stared at oxygen levels in ancient air bubbles trapped in amber. Her graphs showed numbers that seemed impossible. So much oxygen, so much breath. She whispered, "No wonder the bugs were giants." And she wrote her notes, knowing she was writing not just data, but history. In the wild, where no path was marked and no building stood, a single piece of fossil bark stuck out of the ground like a finger pointing up. Wind blew past it. Rain fell on it. A bird landed on it, then flew away. The bark didn't move, but it stayed. It lasted. And someday, someone would find it. The Carboniferous did not end with a bang. It ended with stillness, with swamps drying, with trees falling, with the air changing. And from that ending came new life. Reptiles, seeds, mountains, ice. But the memory of what came before was not erased. It was pressed deep, into coal, into stone, into us. The boy closed his notebook. The girl stepped away from the museum glass. The scientist paused her test. The miner leaned back in the dark. And the wind moved softly through the modern forest, touching leaves that did not know their own story. But the earth knew, and the Carboniferous was still there, not as forest, not as swamp, but as a quiet echo inside the soil, inside the flame, inside the breath of the world. And now, we carry it forward, not in bones, not in fire, but in memory and in wonder.